All right, everybody, we are getting started on a book. The book that we are talking about today is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Sorry, Frankenstein. No, Frankenstein. Why this book? Well, for a couple reasons. One of them is very pragmatic, is that I've been teaching this book to my students for a couple of years now, so I know it pretty well. And since this is going to be the first book that I talk about on my YouTube channel, I may as well talk about something that I know pretty well. If you're watching this years in the future, I hope that I've only gotten better, but who knows. Anyway, why talk about Frankenstein? Well, Frankenstein's a really neat book. First of all, it was written by Mary Shelley as a teenager, so if you haven't written an immortal science fiction classic yet by the time you're 19 or so, sorry, you haven't beaten Mary Shelley's record yet. You can do it, though. Go get them. This story has spawned so many movies and books and derivative works and things like that. We've all seen Boris Karloff in the big green headpiece. We've all watched Young Frankenstein, but you should if you haven't. But why? What is it about this story that has been so long-lived? And for that matter, how many of you, yes, you, have actually read this book? Not as many as you think. A lot of people think they know Frankenstein because they've seen the movies. You know the movie Frankenstein, you do not know the book Frankenstein. So we're going to talk about the book Frankenstein. We're going to talk about how the book is a commentary on many, many things. I think that Shelley is doing a lot of talk here about our relationship to technology and our relationship to science, right? Because the main character, Victor, is a scientist at heart, and he starts off the book, and we'll get to this in a bit, deeply, deeply desiring to know how the universe works, how the world works. He has a desperate need for knowledge, and that is what leads him astray. So is Mary Shelley perhaps telling us that our desperate need for knowledge is going to lead us into some horrible, evil pact with a monster? Maybe. Many people have used Frankenstein as a sort of a metaphor or an analogy for nuclear bombs, or perhaps for GMO foods, right? We hear Frankenfoods all the time. So there is that. I think also, though, what often gets left out of this when people talk about Frankenstein is they talk about the sci-fi aspect of it, right? Making a monster and our relationship with technology. But it's also a book about family and community and where the individual has to sort of fit in with that family and community, what it brings for us, what it delivers for us, and what happens when we don't have it, when it is not provided. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about in this book, and well, why don't we get started? All right, so a little bit about the story, the plot. I'll try not to get into too much detail. Believe me, when I first planned this video, I got into too much detail, but I'll try not to do that. Basically, this story is a really interesting structure. It is a nested structure, so we have a story, and within it 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 a story. Why did Shelley do this? Well, we'll talk about that and try to figure it out. But the main sort of outer shell of this story is this guy, Captain Walton, who is an explorer who is trying to find the North Pole, which for some reason he believes is this beautiful tropical paradise. And he wants to be the first person to discover it. And he's writing these letters to his sister, assuring her that he's okay, everything is fine, but also relaying his adventures getting closer to the North Pole. He runs into Victor Frankenstein, who is, when we meet him, he is exhausted, he is emaciated, he is pursuing an unknown adversary across the ice. He's invited onto the ship, and Walton tends to him and helps him become, hopefully, his friend, maybe. So Victor, recovering, decides that he's going to tell his story to Captain Walton because he recognizes a certain level of ambition in Captain Walton that he knows got him in trouble. So he starts to tell the story about how as he was a young man, he loved science, and he read old philosophers of science. He went to university, studied chemistry, and what he figured out was how to give life to the lifeless. And so he put together a creature. We know this bit already. How he did it, we'll get to that, but Mary Shelley doesn't tell us that. Well, I should say Victor. Mary Shelley doesn't let Victor tell us that, but we'll get to that. Victor creates the creature. He's so horrified by what he has made that he runs away and abandons it completely. He has a complete nervous breakdown, goes back home, discovers that his brother has been murdered, that one of their family friends is on trial for it, and it completely ruins him. And he, at this point, is beginning to suspect that the creature he created is responsible for this. So he goes hiking in the mountains to clear his head, and there he runs into the creature. And that's where we get into the next section of the story, where the creature starts to tell his story, how he woke up alone, friendless, cold, without language or anything, and he slowly develops an awareness of the world. He tried to interact with people, but he was met with violence or cruelty or horror because he's a horrifying looking creature, and eventually ended up camping out next to a small hut by a family called the de Lacys, who were refugees from Paris, who had to leave there. There's a whole other story in there, is the de Lacy family. But he stays with them for a long time. Well, he stays listening. They don't know he's there. It's very important. And he learns to speak, and he learns a lot about the world and what it is, and about people and who they are and stuff like that. And he sees them as his protectors, as his models for what it means to be human. And finally, he takes the chance to introduce himself to the father, who is blind. So there's sort of maybe a little level of protection there. They're having a lovely conversation until the rest of the de Lacy family comes in, and they shriek in horror, and they throw stones at him, and he runs away. And he decides that this is all Victor's fault, and he is going to go exact his revenge. And he does by killing William. He then finds Victor, and they have this conversation, and that's where that particular shell that opens back up. And the monster wants Victor to make him a wife, create something new. Victor's not happy about this. The creature says, look, you make me a wife, I'll take her to South America, and you'll never see us again. Victor grabs his best friend, Henry, good old Henry. They zip up to Scotland. He starts putting together a wife, but he has second thoughts, and he destroys the wife, and the creature kills Henry. And Victor has to go to Ireland for a bit. He ends up in Ireland. He goes to jail for a little bit. His father brings him home. But he gets married to his not quite sister, not a sister, but very, very close family friend, Elizabeth. Gets married to her. They go up. He thinks, I'm happy. The creature, of course, kills Elizabeth, and that's where Victor decides he's going to hunt down this creature, destroy him. That eventually leads us to Captain Walton's ship. Victor succumbs to all of his injuries and his wounds and dies. The creature, sensing this somehow, shows up on the ship, gives a big speech to Captain Walton, and says he's going to go and kill himself out on the ice somewhere. And that, my friends, is the story. Very condensed. Mary Shelley's going to come at me with a switchblade, I am absolutely sure. All right, so why don't we start this off by talking about the two main characters of the book. So there's an old English teacher joke that the smart person knows that Frankenstein is not the monster, but a wise person who's read the book knows that Frankenstein absolutely is the monster in the story. So let's start by talking about him, good old Victor Frankenstein. He is sort of an absentee father, if you will. He creates the creature, and then he just abandons it. He runs away. As soon as the creature opens its eyes, Victor freaks out and he runs. That's it. And throughout the entire book, at no point does Victor ever really regret leaving the creature. He regrets creating the creature. Absolutely. And he feels responsible for what it has done. It's murder. He says at one point when Justine, their family friend, is on trial for the murder of Victor's young brother. Justine, of course, didn't do it. The monster did it. But Victor, in his narration, says, the tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold. So there he is. He's watching this woman endure a miscarriage of justice, right? She is pressured into pleading guilty. But he's still thinking, but I am suffering so much more than she is. Now, the thing is, Victor himself is refusing to support this creature, and he could have stayed with it when it opened its eyes. He could have held back against his horror that he felt when he saw it, and he could have raised this creature, could have done basically like what Gene Wilder did in Young Frankenstein, right? Which has been freaked out, but figured out a way to make it work. Victor could have done that. He didn't, which is interesting because, Victor himself had a fantastic support structure around him. He had loving parents who indulged his intellectual whims. He had his not quite sister Elizabeth, who he's been betrothed to for forever. He has Henry Clerval, his very, very best friend, where Victor is this hyper-rational person, Clerval is more about poetry and history and things like that. They kind of go together really, really well. If you want to write a fun fanfic, it's got to be Victor and Henry. Venry? Anyway, he has this great support structure, people who should be helping him and showing him what it means to be a supportive person. But he's always pushing these people away because he feels like, especially after creating the creature, he feels like if he reveals what he's done, they're going to hate him for what he did. And even before the creature, he found he liked to be alone. He didn't want to be with other people. He studied on his own. He worked on his own. whenever possible, he worked by himself. So Victor is an isolated person, and he continues this isolation when the creature is created. He, like I said, he runs away, and he imparts upon this creature a loneliness from the moment it is born. And I think Shelley may have been projecting a bit. Again, like I said, her mom died several days after Mary was born. So Mary never having really known her mom, could that have been part of this? Maybe. I wouldn't be surprised, frankly. But one of the questions that it brings up for us then is, how responsible should Victor be, right? Is it not unreasonable for Victor to be afraid when this homunculus, this flesh golem that he's made, actually opens its eyes and speaks? Of course, it's freaky, it's weird. We can understand him for having run away. It does make sense. It was not the best choice, but it does make sense. This kind of gets to a bigger philosophical question, right? Of what is the responsibility of a creator to its creation? And from there, we can extrapolate a lot, and we'll maybe go on this in the final video for this book, but ideas about what God owes to humanity, or what parents owe to their children, things like that. And the creature, of course, sees Victor as this betrayer, right? He even, several points in the book, he compares Victor to God, says, I should have been your Adam, and he compares himself to Satan, the fallen devil, as well. So that is Victor, right? In a nutshell, this brilliant man who did an utterly impossible thing and then made the wrong choice. Which, to be fair, that is kind of what fiction works on. If the characters always made the best choices, we wouldn't really have much in the way of story. However, I think a version of Frankenstein where Victor did not run, a sort of what-if version of Frankenstein, if you will, where Victor did not run, where he stayed with the creature and he taught it to be human, that would be a fascinating story in itself. But that's not the story that Mary Shelley wanted to tell us. The creature is really, really interesting, because the creature starts off innocent, right? Like, again, in the early 1800s and what, like, people believe babies were basically innocent, unless you're Catholic and you believe that babies are automatically going to hell until they get baptized, but that's not the point of the story. The creature was innocent. The creature knew nothing. The creature had no sense of self. The creature didn't understand the world. The creature was a blank slate upon which things could be written. And he was faced by, as soon as he met human beings, he was faced by anger and violence, because he looked very strange, because his features, Victor says that his features were meant to be beautiful, but there was something very uncanny about it. I think this is maybe Mary Shelley starting to explore the concept of the uncanny valley. It has all the human parts, all of the bits and pieces, but they don't quite look right. Yeah, he is faced with anger and hatred for no, as far as he can see, no good reason. And then he runs into the de Lacy family, and they are just lovely, right? They've been through their hardships. They were kicked out of Paris for a variety of reasons. The son, Felix, is in love with this woman, Safie, who has to escape from her terrible father. And the father, of course, is the reason the de Lacys got kicked out of Paris. It's a whole thing. And the creature learns so much from them. He learns language. He learns speech. He learns things about the world. He kind of gets his hands on some books. And he starts to learn history. He starts to learn philosophy. He is clearly very, very intelligent. He absorbs all of this really fast. And then he meets them. And he is, in his mind anyway, betrayed. Because he has created this, what we would now call a very strong parasocial bond with the de Lacy family. He loves them. They've never met him. And as soon as they do, they freak out, because here's this 8-foot-tall flesh golem who's hanging around their house. And he feels really betrayed by this family. And he kind of gets sick and tired of it. And he starts to say things like, I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind, right? A bit of a hyperbole, sure, but in his experience, that's what he's found. He's found that he is shunned and hated. He is a victim of violence wherever he should go, just because of who he is and what he looks like and how he behaves. And in a way, it actually made me think of, this is a bit of a digression, but my students will be used to this. I digress all the time. In a way, this made me think of incel logic, right? This, oh, nobody likes me, and because nobody likes me, I'm going to become a really crappy person. Because rather than work on myself, I'm going to be angry and misogynistic and terrible. Now, to be fair, the creature had a lot going against him. He didn't even look really human, as we've said. He looked almost human, but not quite human. But he still took that sort of idea, right? The world is treating me so badly, therefore I must be bad, and I will be bad. And he says, when he plants evidence on Justine that kind of frames her for the murder of William. He says, "The murder I have committed because I am forever robbed of all that she could give me, she shall atone. The crime had its source in her, be hers the punishment." And so there's that incel logic for you, right? He says, the woman doesn't like me, women don't like me, I'm never going to have a girl, therefore they must all suffer. And that's what he does to Justine. That's how Justine ends up getting accused of and convicted of and hanged for the crime of murdering William Frankenstein. But the question we got to ask ourselves at some point in the story is this. The creature is really smart. The creature is very intelligent. The creature picks up a lot really quickly. We saw that with the de Lacy family, but couldn't the creature figure out that the way he's dealing with all of this isn't very good? Now, to be fair, he is very young. He is, by the time Victor's story ends, he's maybe like 2 or 3 years old, really. So he doesn't really have the life experience that we would have to understand that sometimes there's not a lot you can do with it. You're born with what you have, and you have to learn to live with it. And maybe murdering everybody you come in contact with is not the best way to resolve your internal issues of self-doubt and undoubtedly body dysmorphia, which is certainly what the creature probably had. Why doesn't he understand that meeting this anger with anger and meeting resentment with resentment? Why doesn't he understand that this is inherently self-destructive, that this is never going to work, right? He doesn't get that. And now, to be fair, psychology, psychotherapy and things didn't really exist in the early 1800s. That wasn't quite a thing yet. So maybe Shelley herself did not really have the tools to allow the creature to explore this. But again, if the creature took the reasonable, rational route, we'd have no story. So we've got the creature here who thinks of himself as this tormented being who should have been accepted, should have been loved, should have been brought into the world with kindness and generosity, but he wasn't, so he is evil by necessity. Again, I understand, I cannot condone. And how does he think of Victor? Well, he thinks of Victor as a greater monster than he is. I mean, who would bring something like this into the world? And then later, when the creature offers him a deal, right? Make me a wife and I'll leave you alone. Victor reneges on that deal. Victor destroys the wife that he's been building. So, of course, Victor is terrible. Victor clearly only wants the creature to suffer. That's it. But the creature has made Victor suffer. So why shouldn't they make each other suffer? Again, there's bigger lessons to be learned from this, that a cycle of violence and revenge really only leads to more violence and revenge until one or the other of you ends up immolating themselves on a frozen ice floe somewhere. But what do we learn about this, right? What is the nature of this relationship between these two? Are they father and son? Are they God and Adam or God and Satan? Honestly, they're a lot alike in a lot of ways. Neither of them fit very well into society, right? Victor is this hyper-intellectual loner who doesn't like to really talk to people except his best buddy Henry. And his personality keeps him separate from people. And for the creature, it's his appearance. He is immediately recognized as something that's not quite human, and people push him away for that. Now, Victor can fake it. Victor can pass, in our modern parlance, as a normal person. The creature can't do that. The creature, as soon as you see him, unless the creature is talking to a blind person like Mr. de Lacy, the creature can't pass as a normal person. So Victor has at least that much going for him that he can use to get by in the world as a monster, as we've decided that he is. If we decide that the creature and Victor are, let's say the creature and Victor are metaphors, and I'm going to dip into things that Shelley herself could not have written them as, because these are some ideas that come after that, right? Again, the idea of generational rifts, how that's certainly exists in Shelley's time. I take that back, but I'll get to what Shelley couldn't have known. Generational rifts is one thing, right? Our parents never really understand children, never really truly. And the children will always look at the parents as something other, something that is many times to be, you're supposed to grow past your parents. Hopefully you have loving and supportive parents. You want to have loving and supportive parents, but many people have a Victor Frankenstein. They have parents who do not love and support them, who make their lives harder and make their lives miserable every step of the way. And so the parent becomes an adversary. The parent becomes a model of behavior that should be avoided or battled against. And in a good way, people can do that. They can detach themselves from those parents and they can raise their own family in the way that they should have been raised. But sometimes it becomes this horrible cycle where they just get locked into each other. And nobody wins. Nobody's happy about this. But they can't find any alternative to this. We could talk about this in terms of geopolitics. This is where Shelley may not have been thinking. You can talk about this with, you could maybe, if you really wanted to, if you're very good at this sort of thing, you could dig into sort of a post-colonial reading of Frankenstein if you want to set up Victor and the creature as analogies or metaphors for colonial powers and for the states that they colonized. And you could see sort of what brings about this post-colonial rush, why these countries, these nations wanted to throw off the yoke of colonialism, get rid of the parent, as it were, who was holding them back or who was treating them poorly, and to then establish their own identities, and how that does sometimes result in violence, many times results in violence, where you have an armed revolution or rebellion where things go poorly. And you can see in some cases where these rebellions and revolutions and civil wars just extend and extend and extend and extend. You can see sort of the Irish troubles, how they went on for decades and decades and decades and decades, many, many, many years, where at a certain point you kind of have to stop and say, well, who's winning here? And the answer is nobody's winning. Book fell on the floor. I think Mary Shelley has something to say about who was winning. But no, that's not the point. You could use Frankenstein in a sense as a metaphor for that. Is it a perfect metaphor? Absolutely not, because then you would have to say, oh, the British created the Irish and they didn't, or the Israeli government created the Palestinians and they certainly did not. But again, if you want to talk about cycles of violence and how violence and revenge and this determination to get revenge is ultimately destructive to both parties, Frankenstein's a great place to look for it. Shelley's not the first one to come up with this idea. This idea is ancient. But nevertheless, she put it into a really interesting package and a very interesting story that you can, again, derive that meaning from. I sometimes wonder, again, this is out of the Romantic period of the arts. This was, if my research was right, this was a time when a lot of artists and writers and poets were kind of reacting against this sort of hyper-intellectual movement of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and they were going back to the idea of exploring emotion and feeling and the darkness and deepness of nature and all that it encompasses and stuff like that. So is this Shelley trying to comment on maybe what man was not supposed to know, what maybe the limits of our reason and our science can take us, and what can happen if they take us too far? Maybe she was. I don't know for particularly the particulars of it, but I think, again, we can take that analogy and we can look at what we do in science today, how we talk about gene editing. We talk about CRISPR, for example, or GMO foods. And people are understandably terrified of these things in a way because they don't really understand the science that goes through it. And just like Victor never explained the science that brought the creature to life, and maybe for a lot of people who are terrified of GMO foods, they need the science perhaps a little better explained to them. But there's a reason why Frankenfood became a thing, or at least a name, I should say. Victor versus the creature. It is at the heart of this story. There is no story without Victor and the creature, and I think a lot more could be said about the relationship between these two. But I want to keep these videos reasonably short. I am not an epic YouTube essayist, so I want them to be more digestible. But something for you to think about as you go off and wait for the next video is, who is your Victor Frankenstein? Who is the person in your life who should have helped you but let you down? And how did you react to that? How did you deal with the knowledge that your life could have been better if this person had been better? Contrarily, who is your creature? To whom did you owe responsibility that you failed, that you did not keep up? Whose life did you ruin because of your selfish decisions? We've all got someone, right? We must. Sometimes it's ourselves. We are both Victor and the creature, bound into one as we betray our own hopes and dreams. And that's not the up note I'd hope to leave on, but it's the up note I'm going to leave on. So come back. We'll talk more Frankenstein in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. You know the drill. See you next time.